Hey everybody, I hope y'all are doing well out there and that everybody had a good week and is looking forward to a weekend that hopefully has a nice balance of relaxing and catching up on academic activities. That's what my weekend looks like anyway. So I wanted to throw a hopefully quick uh, recorded lecture out to you guys to kind of bridge the gap between last week's topic and this week's topic. So last week we took a look at ethical principles at autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, fidelity, and veracity. So you'll see that these principles are important throughout, or I guess I should say across a range of different helping professions. Medicine, psychology, counseling, social work. These principles provide a foundation for ethical behavior in most kind of person-oriented, helping-oriented professions. Now, the reason I'm backtracking and talking about principles a little bit is because they really provide the context for an understanding of ethical standards and ethics codes. So why do they do this and how do they do this? Well, clearly ethical principles constitute high standards of behavior. More importantly, and a little bit more specifically, principle ethics, ethics found on principles, allow us to apply a system to ethical decision making. It allows us to identify categories of behavior, behavioral actions, and label them. It allows us to look at what behavior drivers are more important than other behavior drivers. And why are all of these ideas important? Well, they introduce a degree of objectivity into the understanding of ethical behavior. And that objectivity is key. Prior to what's known as the principle ethics movement, ethics were driven largely by a concept known as virtue ethics. Systems like chivalry, for example, would be rooted in virtue ethics. And there's not anything necessarily wrong with virtue ethics, but virtue ethics are much more abstract and difficult to discuss because the emphasis in virtue ethics is the actor, is the ethical decision maker. Things are ethical on the basis of who's doing them, basically. But in order to make ethical decisions in a virtue ethic framework, your guidance is to make decisions as a virtuous person would. So, for example, just a kind of an anecdotal example. I think we've all seen, they're not around as much now as they used to be, but we used to see the WWJD bracelets, What Would Jesus Do bracelets. I'm certainly not knocking the bracelets or Jesus or religion, but that would be an example of a tool that's sort of pushing a virtue ethics angle. Again, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying it's bad in any way, but it's certainly more difficult to apply. If you're faced with an ethical decision, say in your professional environment, you come up to, say, give an assessment to one of your clients, and they need the assessment really quickly, and you have to decide, oh, can I do this right now before I actually have them sign their informed consent? Well, thinking what would Jesus do might not be as helpful as being able to refer to formal objective guidance that actually lays out reasons for what we do. Does that make sense? Again, I don't think that there's anything wrong with including a virtue framework in the way we make ethical decisions, whether we think about emulating Jesus or a mentor or someone else who we see as a person who makes good ethical decisions. I think that can be kind of a great thing to have bouncing around in our minds. At the same time, we need formal, objective systems. This is what ethical principles provide, and because it's what ethical principles provide, it's what ethical standards provide. And I'll hopefully make that connection a little bit more clearly. Just to briefly look at the standards that we talked about last week and that you all read about last week, we've got autonomy. It's the right to self-determination and choice. So it's very important to all of us, I think, especially as Americans, to be able to make choices that we want, to be able to be responsible for our own actions, to not be compelled to do things that we don't want to. There's beneficence. This is the idea that we have a general social obligation to do well and to help people who need help. Non-maleficence is kind of the flip side of that same virtue. We have responsibility to do well under the principle of beneficence. We also have a responsibility to not do harm. We see this in the Hippocratic Oath that physicians take. I'm not sure that I'm going to get the wording exactly right, but thou shalt do no harm. That's an example of non-maleficence. Justice is a principle that expresses the value of fairness, something we value highly as human beings and then as a profession as well. Trying to keep the playing field even. You can look broadly around our culture and see a lot of institutions that are geared towards establishing justice. Some of them non-controversially, some of them controversially. It can be maybe a little bit more difficult to identify what the just course of action is, say compared to the course of action that facilitates autonomy. Because fairness is a difficult idea for people to agree on. We talked about this a little bit back in assessment. Fidelity is the idea of being true to the people who we serve, and this could be our clients, our consumers, and the organization that we work for, and also the profession that we're a part of. Veracity is being truthful, and again, this goes both ways, kind of out towards clients and consumers, and then back inward to the organization that we work for and the profession that we're a part of. So, these 6 principles are rooted in some sort of objective standard. Some of them are a little bit more difficult to pin down, right? Justice, it can be a little more difficult to identify the just course of action than it can be to identify the course of action that facilitates autonomy. Nevertheless, while we might not all agree on the same standards, we can agree that standards can be established for justice. Behavior A reflects justice, behavior B does not reflect justice. This is more difficult to do in a virtue ethics framework. going back to the what would Jesus do bracelets, you could look at two people, each who made a different ethical decision, having an argument with one another about who made the right ethical decision. And both people, before they made their decision, looked at their what would Jesus do bracelet and thought, well, I'm going to do what Jesus would do. They came up with completely different stuff. Well, because in a virtue framework, it's so subjective that it's difficult to collectively come together on how to interpret virtue ethics. So, I know I'm getting a little long-winded here. I'll be shutting it down soon, I promise. Principle ethics is kind of in response to, or provides an answer to, the shortcomings left in virtue ethics. Principle ethics, it involves specific behaviors and actions that can be identified and discussed in an objective manner, and subsequently provides the foundation for ethical standards. And ethical standards, our focus for this week, are what make up our ethics codes. So principle ethics is the big, broad deal, those big 6 broad principles that can be applied across a whole bunch of stuff. Ethical standards, as you'll see as you review your ethics codes as part of your lecture materials for this week, you'll see that, oh, okay, the ethical standards kind of break those principles down into slightly more specific, or actually significantly more specific ideas and guidance. And then you take your ethical standards and you put them in your ethics codes. And that's where you get your ACA Code of Ethics and the Code of Professional Ethics for Rehabilitation Counselors, both of which I ask you to check out as the other part of your lecture for this week. Also, please pay extra close attention to your readings. Currently, these chapters are I think very core. A lot of ideas that you'll want to take with you throughout your career. A lot of ideas that help me determine how I think about ethics, what ethics are for. It's good stuff. Okay, that's enough out of me. You guys enjoy the rest of the weekend. Hit me up if you have any questions. I will be putting up our discussion questions right after I convert this over to a format that I can post. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.